Chapter 2. Riley said the only thing she could think of. I'm surprised you didn't send in the cavalry by now. Grimly, Bishop said I wanted to, believe me, but aside from the fact that all the teams were out and hip deep in investigations, they absolutely couldn't leave. You had insisted you could handle the situation alone and that I shouldn't be concerned if you were out of touch for a while. Any of us going in blind didn't seem like the best of ideas. You're one of the most capable and self-sufficient people I know, Riley. I had to trust you knew what you were doing. Almost absently, she said, I wasn't criticizing you for not riding to the rescue, just sort of surprised you hadn't. Which told her that he himself was undoubtedly hip deep in a case he was unable to leave, whatever she told him. Bishop tended to keep a close eye on his people and was rarely out of touch for more than a day or two during an ongoing investigation. Then again, he also likely would have sensed it if she had been in an actual physical danger, or at any rate had certainly done so more than once in the past. He was like that with some of his agents, though not by any means all of them. And anyway, I'm alright, she said, at least. What? Riley, what the hell's going on down there? His question made her grimace half-consciously, because if Bishop didn't know what was going on here, she was most likely in very big trouble. How on earth had she managed to end up in a situation deadly enough to cover her in blood, and apparently trigger a short-term memory loss, and yet still manage to conceal what was happening from the formidable telepathic awareness of the SCU chief? Perhaps the memory loss had something to do with that, or maybe the same thing that had triggered the memory loss had thrown up some kind of block or shield. She didn't know. Damn it, she just didn't know. Riley, you didn't believe there was a risk of violence, at least according to what you said when you did check in. No suspicious deaths, no one reported missing. I got the impression you were half convinced it was just a series of pranks. Has anything happened to change that? Avoiding the direct question, she asked one of her own. Listen, what else did I say? For a moment, she didn't think he was going to answer, but finally he did. Since you arrived at Opal Island 3 weeks ago, you filed only one formal report, and that one was seriously lacking in details. Just that you'd settled in, you had a reliable contact in the Hazard County Sheriff's Department, and that you were confident you could successfully resolve the situation. Riley drew a breath and said casually, the situation being? The silence this time was, to say the least, tense. Riley? Yeah? Why did you go to Opal Island? I don't remember. Have you been injured? No, she decided, somewhat guiltily, not to mention the blood. Not yet, at any rate. She thought she might need that later. Not so much as a scratch and no bump on the head. Then it's likely to be emotional or psychological trauma, or psychic trauma. Yeah, that was my take. Being Bishop, he didn't waste time exclaiming, what do you remember? Getting here vaguely, renting this house, settling in. After that, just flashes I haven't been able to sort through. What about before you left Quantico? I remember everything, or at least everything through the close of the investigation in San Diego. I got back to the office, started in on all the paperwork, and that's pretty much it until I woke up here a couple of hours ago. What about your abilities? Spider sense seems to be out of commission, but I woke up starving, so that probably doesn't mean anything. I don't know about the clairvoyance yet, but if I had to guess, she knew she had to be honest. Not exactly firing on all cylinders. Bishop didn't hesitate. Go back to Quantico, Riley. Without knowing what's happened here, I can't do that. I don't want to make it an order, and I don't want to disobey one, but I can't just pack up and leave with this huge blank place in my life. Don't ask me to do that, Bishop. Riley, listen to me. You're down there alone, without backup. You can't remember the last 3 weeks. You don't even remember what you're there to investigate, and the abilities that could normally help you focus on and sort through undercurrents aren't available to you, either temporarily or permanently. Now, can you give me a single reason why I should ignore all that and allow you to stay there? She drew a breath and gambled. Yeah, one very big reason. Because when I woke up today, I was fully dressed and covered with dried blood. Whatever happened here, I was up to my elbows in it. One call to the local sheriff and I'd probably be sitting in his jail. So I have to stay here, Bishop. I have to stay until I remember or figure out what the hell's going on. Sue McIntyre wasn't at all happy with the local ordinance that kept dogs off the beach from 8 a.m. until 8 p.m. It wasn't that she minded getting up early to allow her 2 labs a good long run on the beach. It was just that big dogs, hers at least, would have been happier if they'd been able to get out into the water a few times during the day as well, especially during a hot summer. Luckily, there was a big park skirting downtown Castle with an area complete with wading pond where dogs were allowed off-leash any time during the day, so at least once every day, she loaded Pip and Brandy into her Jeep, and off they went across the bridge and onto the mainland. On this Monday afternoon, she didn't expect it to be crowded. Summer visitors tended to be baking on the beach or shopping downtown, so it was mostly locals who used the park, and most of them for the same reason Sue did. She found a space closer to the dog area than usual, and within minutes was throwing a frisbee for Brandy and a tennis ball for Pip, giving all 3 of them plenty of exercise as she threw and they happily fetched. It wasn't until Pip abruptly dropped his ball and shot off into the woods that Sue realized a section of the fence was down, and that the bolder and more curious of her 2 dogs had seized the opportunity presented. Damn. She wasn't too worried. He wasn't likely to head toward the streets and traffic, but neither was he at all likely to respond if she called him, especially since he loved exploring the woods, even more than running on the beach, and had perfected the art of going suddenly and temporarily deaf when his interest was engaged. Sue called Brandy and clipped a leash to her collar, then set off in pursuit of her other dog. One would think it would be easy to see a pale gold dog in the shaded woods, but Pip also had the knack of making himself virtually invisible, so Sue had to rely on Brandy's nose to find her brother. Luckily, it was a common enough occurrence that she didn't have to be told what to do and led her owner steadily through the woods. This patch of woods was fairly uncommon in the area, consisting as it did of towering hardwood trees and fairly dense underbrush rather than the more usual spindly pines and sandy soil. But since it was also less than a mile from downtown Castle, it was hardly what anyone would have called a wilderness. Sue and her dogs had probably explored every inch in the 5 years she lived on Opal Island. Even so, she would have avoided the big clearing near the center of the woods had Brandy not been heading her straight for it. She'd heard the talk about what had been found there a week or so ago, and didn't like the realization that what had seemed to her just an interesting jumble of boulders, providing a seat to pause and enjoy the quiet of the forest, now had a possibly more sinister purpose in her mind. Satanism, that's what people were saying. Sue had never believed in such things, but still, there is no smoke without fire. Hunters weren't allowed in these woods, and why else would somebody kill an animal? Pip began barking. Conscious of a sudden chill, Sue picked up her pace, almost running beside Brandy along the twisting path to the clearing. Anybody who would butcher an animal out in the woods for no good reason, she thought, probably wouldn't hesitate to kill someone's pet, especially if it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Pip! Not that it would do any good to call him, but she was desperately afraid suddenly, afraid in a way she'd never been before, on a level so deep it was almost primal, and that terror had to be voiced in some kind of cry. It wasn't until much later that she realized she had probably smelled the blood long before she reached the clearing. She and Brandy burst into the clearing to find Pip only a couple of yards in, standing still and barking his head off. Not his happy, I'm having fun bark, but an unfamiliar, nearly hysterical sound that spoke of the same primal fear Sue felt herself. Holding the whimpering Brandy close to her side, she went to Pip and fashioned his leash to the collar blindly. her gaze fixed on what was at the center of the clearing. The seemingly innocent jumble of boulders was there, no longer innocent but splashed with blood, a lot of blood. Sue paid little attention to the rocks, however, nor even noticed that there had been a fire built near them. Her gaze was only for what hung over them. Suspended by ropes from a sturdy oak limb, the naked body of a man was only barely recognizable as such. Dozens of shallow cuts all over him had bled a great deal, turning his flesh reddish and clearly dripping down onto the boulders, dripping for a long time. The ropes were tied around the wrists, both of them tied together and stretched above except the wrists weren't stretched above the head. There was no head. Sue turned with a choke cry and ran. It took considerable persuasion, but in the end, Riley prevailed, in a manner of speaking. Bishop agreed not to recall her, but he wasn't willing to leave that open-ended. It was Monday afternoon. She had until Friday to stabilize the situation, by which he meant recover her memories of the last 3 weeks and/or figure out what was going on here. If she couldn't do that to his satisfaction, she'd be recalled to Quantico, and she was to report in every day. One missed report, and he'd send in another team member or members with orders to pull her out. That or come himself. She was also to send the blood-stained clothing she'd awakened wearing to Quantico for testing immediately. Bishop would send a courier within a couple of hours to pick up the package, and if the results showed human blood, all bets were off. "You think it could be animal blood?" she asked. "Since you went down there to investigate reports of possible occult rituals, it may be more likely than not." Bishop paused, then went on. "We've had a number of these reports across the southeast in the last year or so. You remember that much?" She did. "But 9 times out of 10, there's no real evidence of occult activity, or at least nothing dangerous." "Nothing satanic," he agreed, which is always the idea feeding local hysteria, that devil worshippers are conducting robed rituals out in the woods that involve orgies and sacrificing infants. Yeah, when in reality, it's almost always either pranks or just somebody jumping to conclusions when they find something on the weird side while taking their daily constitutional. Exactly, but once the gossip gets going, such incidents are blown out of all proportion, and fear can stir up real trouble, sometimes deadly trouble. "So I came down here to investigate possible occult activity?" Riley was still struggling to remember and still trying to reconcile the clothing and underwear she brought along with what sounded like a perfectly ordinary investigation, for her, at any rate. She was the go-to girl of the SCU when it came to the occult. "The possible beginnings of occult activity," Bishop said. "A friend and former colleague of yours got in touch. He didn't want us down there openly, and in fact lacked the authority to ask us to get involved, but he had a very bad feeling that whatever's going on in Castle and on Opal Island is both serious and more than the local sheriff can handle. So I'm here unofficially, very unofficially, and on the strength of Gordon Skinner's request and your confidence that his instincts were trustworthy." "Yeah, Gordon has a breadth for hunches that pay off. I always figured him for a latent precog, and he's not a man to jump at shadows." Riley frowned to herself. "I guess he got in his 20 and retired just like he planned. To Opal Island?" "So you said." "Okay, well, Gordon's definitely somebody I can trust. If I'm here because of him, it's essential I spent time with him over the last 3 weeks. He can fill me in." "I hope so, because you aren't there undercover, Riley. You haven't hidden the fact that you're an FBI agent, and as far as the locals are concerned, including the sheriff, since you checked in with him when you arrived, you're on Opal Island on vacation, taking some accumulated leave time after a particularly tough case." "Oh," Riley said, "I wonder if that was smart of me, being here openly, I mean." "Unfortunately, I have no idea, but it's clearly too late to second-guess that decision." "Yeah, so I picked the island for a vacation spot because my old army buddy Gordon retired here." "It gave you a legitimate reason to be there." Riley sighed. "And that's all you know?" His silence spoke volumes, and she hastily added, Right, my fault. Should have reported in. And I'm sure when I remember why I didn't report in, there'll be a good reason. I hope so. Sorry, Bishop. Just be careful, will you, please? I know you can take care of yourself, but we both know investigations that turn up genuine black occult practices or some other variation of evil go south more often than not, usually in a hurry. Yeah, the last one involved a serial killer, didn't it? Don't remind me. She wasn't all that happy to have reminded herself, because that memory at least was quickly all too clear. She had come within a hair of being that particular killer's final victim. I don't like any of this, Riley, for the record, Bishop said. I know. Remember, you report some degree of success by Friday, or I pull the plug. Got it, don't worry. I've got Gordon to watch my back if necessary while I figure out what's going on. Be careful, he repeated. I will. She cradled the receiver and stood there for a minute or so, frowning. Her headache was finally easing off, but although the pounding was somewhat muffled now, so were her senses. She refilled her coffee cup, then rummaged in the pantry for the high-calorie power bars she tended to buy by the case. It was normal for her to carry at least 2 of them in her purse or back pockets at all times. If she didn't eat something about every hour or 2, she simply couldn't function at peak efficiency. Psychic efficiency. Several of the other SCU members envied her the high metabolism that enabled her to eat anything she wanted, and rather astonishing quantities of it at that, without getting an ounce. But they also understood the downside. It was not always possible for Riley to eat enough or often enough during the course of a busy investigation to continually provide fuel for her abilities, and at least once it had nearly cost a life, hers. She ate a power bar with her coffee and placed 2 more in the shoulder bag she had found. She checked the contents of the purse just on the off chance that something unusual might trigger her memories, but everything looked normal. She tended to travel light, so there wasn't much. Keys to her rental car and this house, a small pocket, phone/address book, tube of lip balm. She wasn't a lipstick kind of girl. Mirrored compact with pressed powder that was barely used, because she wasn't a makeup kind of girl either, unless the situation called for it. Billfold with cash, credit cards in their protective case, and her driver's license. Her FBI ID folder and badge would be in her nightstand, or should be, since she was technically off duty. She went and checked, and it was. Returning to the main living area, Riley turned on the TV to CNN to check the date and find out if she'd missed anything crucial in the way of world news. July 14th, and the last clear, solid memory she could claim was somewhere around June 20th at Quantico. Paperwork at the desk, nothing unusual. Feeling a little drained, which was normal for her following the conclusion of a tough investigation. And then, nothing but flashes. Whispers in her mind, snatches of conversation that made no sense. Faces and places she thought she knew, but couldn't put names to. Feelings that were oddly unsettled and even chaotic for a woman who tended to take a reasonable, rational approach to life. Riley shook that off and frowned at the TV. Okay, so she wasn't doing so hot. How went the world? 1 earthquake, 2 political scandals, a celebrity divorce, and half a dozen violent crimes later, she muted the set and returned to the kitchen for more coffee. Same old, same old. I can't just hide in this house until it all comes back to me, she muttered to herself. For one thing, there was no guarantee it would. Short-term memory loss linked to some kind of trauma wasn't all that uncommon, but in a psychic, it could also be a symptom of bigger problems. Bishop hadn't need to remind her of that. For another thing, nothing here was sparking her memory, and she needed information fast. Needed to have some idea of what was going on here. So the most imperative order of business was clearly contacting Gordon. She took the time first to bag the clothing she'd been wearing and managed to find what she needed to construct a decent package for shipment back to Quantico. And she did another search through the house, this time looking intently for anything unusual. Aside from the sexy underwear, there was nothing she considered unusual. which meant that she found nothing to either answer any of her questions or raise more. By the time she was finished with the more thorough search, she'd also eaten another power bar, and her headache was all but gone. But when she attempted to tap into her extra senses, she got nothing. No deeper, more intense connection to her surroundings. That was her spider sense. As for her clairvoyance, she was stronger with people than with objects, so it was difficult for her to be certain that extra sense was out to lunch when she was in the house all alone. The doorbell rang, and Riley's first reaction was an intense suspicion that came from both training and a lifelong addiction to mystery novels and horror movies. A visitor just when she needed one was not a good sign. She took her gun with her, held down at her side until she reached the front door. A small clear glass viewing panel in the solid wood door allowed her to see who was on the porch. A woman in a sheriff's deputy uniform, no hat. She was a tall redhead, rather beautiful, and I don't know, Riley. We just don't see this sort of thing around here. Peculiar symbols burned into wood or drawn in the sand. An abandoned building and a house under construction, both burned to the ground. That stuff we found out in the woods that you say could indicate someone's been performing or attempting some kind of occult ritual. Leah, so far it's just bits and pieces, and weird bits and pieces at that. What do you mean? I mean, something's not adding up. The flash of memory vanished as quickly as it had come, but the knowledge it left her with was certain. Deputy Leah Wells was her reliable contact inside the sheriff's department. Riley stuck her automatic inside the waistband of her jeans at the small of her back, then unlocked and opened the door. "Hey," she said, "what's up?" "Nothing good," Leah replied grimly. "Sheriff sent me to get you. There's been a murder, Riley."